All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our hurricane preparation and recovery webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars on this theme. And we're going to be getting into hurricane season soon, so it's a good time to start thinking about some of these things. For those that don't know me, my name is Chris Demers. I'm an extension program manager here at the School of Forest, Fisheries and Geomatic Sciences, formerly known as the School of Forest Resources and Conservation. We just went through a name change almost a month ago now. So we're all adapting to the new name, incorporating that on all of our slides and signatures and whatnot. So thanks for joining us today. For those who aren't familiar with our program, the purpose or the mission of our Florida Land Steward program, which many of you are involved with that are participating in this today. If you're new to it, we provide networking and educational services for private forest landowners, also for the foresters and natural resource professionals that work with private landowners and on other lands. And the mission is really to help landowners to manage their forest properties or land resources for multiple benefits, for long-term economic and environmental sustainability. So this building resilience theme incorporates a lot of things outside of what you might think of in terms of hurricanes and storms. We're talking about the resilience of our operation, which it's related to hurricane preparation and storm resilience, but really it's about making the whole operation resilient in terms of what's going on in the land, our planning, our organization, our connections, a whole collection of things. So we're biting off a big chunk here today. You could almost call this webinar Forestry 101. Before we really get into the topic at hand, I want to go ahead and go through some housekeeping things, many of which you are familiar with if you participated in these webinars before. Please use the Q&A to ask questions. Don't use the chat. I won't be monitoring the chat for questions. I'll be using the Q&A after the presentation is done. So put in your questions as you think of them, and then I'll be doing my best to answer questions at the end. And if I don't know the answers to questions, I will do my best to find those answers for you. Also, at the end of the webinar, I've got a evaluation that should launch automatically. Please take time to answer that, to answer those questions, very brief, just to get your impacts. That's also an opportunity to get connected to our newsletter, email updates as appropriate. And if you're interested, if you don't get those Florida Land Steward email updates that come in once a week or every other week, we encourage you to get connected to those so you can keep posted on webinars like this. And hopefully we'll be getting back to in-person events before the end of the year, looking at the fall for getting back to in-person events. So looking forward to that. But the webinars have been great. Also want to encourage you to get the slides of this presentation, all the links that I'm providing, all the resources, all those links are live in the PDF presentation that's available on our program site here. Once you get there to this homepage, you're going to look for this sentence right here. You're going to click on that link right there, and that'll get you to a page. And then you're going to click on this drop down, the 2021 Hurricane Prep and Recovery Webinars. And if you're not familiar with that page, it looks like this. And that's going to be the link you're going to click to get to all the resources, all the recordings of all of our webinars we've done in the past, all the materials, all the slides that go with those are all on this page. So take advantage of that. Also, the reminder email you got about this webinar yesterday and today, you should have got one at the end, at the bottom of that email. I wish it was at the top, but it ends up being at the bottom on the Zoom. That also has the link directly to that page where you can get those resources. So if you have any trouble, drop me a line. I'm happy to provide them to you myself if you're not able to find those. All right, so we all enjoy it when we get a break from storms. It seems like every year one part of the region or another gets slammed. Eventually, it's our turn to get slammed by one of these things. So recent storms that have gotten our attention: Hurricane Irma in 2017, September, I remember that one well. Slammed through the peninsula, really kind of rode up the coast. $261 million in timber damage from that storm. And of course, the one that got all of our attention across the state was Hurricane Michael in 2018. We're still in the throes of this storm, trying to recover, trying to salvage, trying to restore. We did a webinar on hurricane recovery last year, and all the presentations are available from that, where we talked about the block grant. That block grant is still open. It's open until the end of this month. So if you were impacted by this storm, you can still sign up for that recovery assistance from that forest recovery block grant. And like I said, please contact me at any time if you need to get connected to that resource. Still some money available and still time to apply. But 2.8 million acres, $1.3 billion in timber damages. I think some of the people that are registered for the webinar today went through this storm and know this well, and are attending this webinar knowing that there's things that they can do to get ready. And I encourage you to share that when you're in. If you have Q&A, use that Q&A to share tips that I'm not covering today. We're covering a lot of material today, so I want people to share what they know, what they've learned about this topic. All right, and there's the path of the storm. I think most of us remember how that went. That really big swath of catastrophic damage through the middle of the panhandle there, and that's really where that picture on the slide before was taken. You know, just huge areas of timber just laid down. Whatever couldn't bounce back from the wind just snapped. I'd like to take this opportunity to launch a poll so I can get some information about you. I'd like to find out kind of where are you in your land management journey, your stewardship journey. Have you owned land for 5 years or longer? Have you been doing this for a while? Are you a new landowner? Have you just got the property? You're just kind of finding your way, trying to find assistance. Glad that you're connected. Are you an agency person? Looks like agency people are the ones that are replying now. Are you looking to buy property? Is this something that you're brand new to and you're just getting assistance as it's coming? And then, how did you come about your property? Was it purchased? Did you inherit it? Was it gifted? These all come into play as we're trying to figure out our basis, which we're going to be talking about. And then, has your property sustained damage from a hurricane or other disaster? And looks like almost half. I'm going to give another few seconds for people to answer these questions, and then we'll look at the results. All right. It's like most of the landowners have owned their property for 5 years or longer. And then we've got a pretty good split between purchased and inherited property. And yeah, looks like good number have had damage, have been through this before. So thank you for participating in that. It's good to know the audience a little bit as we're going through this. All right, I just want to recognize some of the assistance that's out there and resources that I've used to put together this presentation. This is an excellent guide that came out about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. That really was kind of after Hurricane Michael. I think that got a lot of attention. So this guide, there's a whole series of these hurricane preparation and recovery in the southeastern United States, and they've got them for other regions too, produced by the USDA. And they've got these guides for different kinds of producers, row crops, You name it. If it's a crop, they have a hurricane prep and recovery guide for it. So this is the Pine Forest Landowners Guide. I kind of use this as kind of the outline of how I set up the presentation. So this presentation that I'm giving today kind of follows the flow of this guide, and then I use some other resources and some other information to kind of fill in some of the other information that I'm providing. But this is a good guide. It's provided on that resource page. I encourage you to download it and take a look at it. There's some good stuff in there. We've got an EDIS publication that's it's not online yet. It's been held up. But anyways, I've got a PDF of it. We also printed it as a newsletter article in our Land Steward newsletter in the spring summer 2020. That kind of goes through kind of the more immediate preparation tips before the storm, and I kind of drew on that as well, and that came out of some of these other hurricane prep tips for other agricultural operations and tips and feedback from the field. So this is pulled together from a lot of different resources. So this comes out of that guide, that USDA Pine Forest Landowner Guide. This webinar is going to cover kind of this part of the flow chart. Initial site planning, if you're assessing risk of property that you're looking to buy or your own property, then building a resilient operation, and a little bit of this long-term operation maintenance. We're going to get into that a little bit today too. The second webinar on June 3rd is really going to focus on short-term preparedness, what to do when you get into hurricane season after June 1st. This is the time to start looking at some of these immediate short-term things that you can do to get ready for the storm. Then in late August, I think August 26th, we're going to be getting into this section 4, post-hurricane recovery, some of the steps you can take. And this is a process. This isn't a once and done kind of a topic. These are things that you're going to be doing throughout the year. You're going to be, everything that you're doing is feeding back into the beginning, into the planning. Forests are dynamic, storms are dynamic, everything is in a constant change. And so we're always having to go back and revisit a lot of these things as time goes on and make sure that we're ready every single year, and making sure that our property and our management is resilient. All right, this is a useful model. What do they say about models? All models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So none of this is surprising, right? This shows us the return period for major hurricanes defined as a storm with winds in excess of 110 miles per hour. And, we know from experience, for those of us that have lived in the South for 20 years or more, we've seen these patterns, right? These South Florida gets slammed, the Panhandle gets slammed. These are all these areas where storms will frequent, and the red dots indicate more frequent occurrence of very strong storms. And of course, the paths go throughout. This shows those coastal counties. If you've got property in a coastal county, this kind of preparation and these ideas are really important to consider. And then if the further you are inland, generally the safer you are. However, we learned that in 2018, seems like last year, 2018, Hurricane Michael came through the central panhandle and stayed a Category 4 storm right up into Georgia and Alabama. Right up into here, it was still a Category 4 to Category 3 storm, and did a lot of damage. So that's a lesson learned. These hurricanes tend to be increasing in intensity, and if they're slow moving, they can do a lot of damage. All right, initial site planning. Take a look at your site. Even if you can use this if you're looking at property to purchase, or if you've just inherited land. Assess the risks that you have on that property. What's the topography? What's the drainage? What's the risk of flooding, surface flooding, or coastal surge? If you're in that coastal county, you've got a much greater chance of having coastal storm surge impact where you are. Are you low lying or are you on high ground? If you're in this kind of a situation with a lot of palmetto and gallbed, that's a flatwood site. That can have standing water in it when after a lot of rain. What are your slopes like? What kind of forest communities are you on? Are you high and dry up on a scrub and sand hill? Are you kind of in the middle in those music hardwoods, flatwoods, or are you down the bottom? And and a lot of you, if that own forest property, you might have a combination of these, and so you're going to want to assess your risk by the area you're looking at. And then this is kind of an extreme example down here, but how is there drainage somehow on that property? Are there ditches? Are there canals? These kinds of things that are on kind of more intensive agricultural operations. And into South Florida, we have the canals. You see these drainage ditches in certain places, but take a look at those drainage situations, and were they well installed, and have they been maintained? You want to try to assess that, because once those things get blocked up, it can lead to issues. And there's a lot of tools available to assess the historic patterns, which areas are at risk of flooding and coastal sturge. This FEMA map is useful. You can get on there, you can find your property, and it will show you kind of the historic flooding pattern on right on your property, so you can really get an idea of what the flood risk is. So if there's a slow moving storm that's dropping a lot of water, you can have an idea and assess that risk of flooding. All right, if you've got a lot of value in timber in your forest stand, it's a good idea to have a forest inventory. And what a forest inventory is a documentation of the condition and the types of trees, sizes of trees, what kinds of forest products you have, and ultimately what value you have in that stand. And of course, that can help us to estimate what's standing and what's not standing after a storm for tax purposes, insurance purposes, assistance program purposes. We want to have as much documentation. That's one of the take-home points of this. We want to have as much documentation as we can, and an inventory can put us in a position to have that documentation in the long term. And inventories are something that take place not just once, but periodically as the stand develops. And the inventory can help us guide forest management. And one big question, especially if you have mature timber on your property, is, and if your objectives are primarily financial or economic, if you've got mature timber, is it a good idea to harvest that timber now? Or, are you going to be taking a risk of having that timber stand, maybe go through a major storm and have a lot of damage, and you're not going to be able to salvage much of that value after a big storm? So this is a big question that you want to try to assess every year as your timber matures. When's a good time to harvest that timber? Am I getting toward financial maturity? What's the risk of keeping it on the stump for another year and going through another storm season? So if you've got mature timber, really consider the options, and maybe consider harvesting that timber outside of hurricane season or before hurricane season. Also, you want to consider any other treatments outside of hurricane season too, thinning especially. We want to keep our thinning operations outside of hurricane season. And if you've got a thinning operation that's underway and there's a hurricane coming, you want to cease that operation. And we'll be talking about density in a little bit, but it really has to do with those trees protecting each other from those high winds. And when you thin the stand, especially shortly after a thinning, those trees can be highly susceptible to damage and falling down on the wind. We learned that from Hurricane Michael. There was a lot of thinned areas that just got decimated. Of course, it's a Category 4 storm, so that's going to take out a lot of timber regardless. But you can increase your resilience by keeping thinning operations outside of hurricane season and considering timber harvests before the storm comes. And then the types of measurements that we do in a forest inventory, we want to get tree species, number of trees per acre, some measurement of density, tree diameters and heights. And from those measurements, we can calculate volumes and values. A couple of publications here. 131 here is kind of a primer on what an inventory is. And then this 426 is kind of goes into more in depth of how an inventory is done and how you can do a kind of an informal or at-home inventory. There's some things you can measure, and you can kind of do some calculations yourself. Always best to hire a forester to get the really good inventory. If you don't, especially if you really don't know what you're doing with it. We'll be talking about that as well. All right, financial basis. This is the fun stuff. Why do we want to know our financial basis? Well, that all comes down to casualty loss. So what's casualty loss? That's damage, destruction, loss of property that is sudden, unexpected, or an unusual event that causes property damage, like a hurricane, tornado, fire, or earthquake, right? So sudden natural event takes place and takes out your trees. Now here's the bad news, I guess. No, the good news is you can possibly deduct some of that loss, but for timber held mainly for business or investment purposes, the amount that you can deduct for casualty loss is the smaller of the adjusted basis of timber and the difference of the fair market value immediately before and after the loss. And the IRS will not recognize casualty loss until that basis is established, right? So it's really important to have an idea of what your basis is. Is it possible for your basis to be zero? Yes, that's the real bad news. It is possible for your basis to be zero. And in that case, you really want to consider insurance, especially if you want to be reimbursed for anything that you've lost in a hurricane. So basis, what is basis? The amount of money invested in the timber itself, excluding the amount of that value that's in the land. So it is the value, that the purchase value of the timber itself, excluding the land. And then the adjusted basis is the original basis reduced or increased by adjustments over the term of the ownership. So increases by new purchases or decreases by timber sales. So how do we calculate basis? Well, it depends on how you came about your property. That's why I asked you, did you purchase your property? Was it inherited or was it gifted? For purchase property, your basis is the purchase cost, not fair market value, allocated separately from the land, right? So that's just the value of the timber as a part of that total purchase price, as a percentage of that purchase price. And sometimes that can be calculated kind of on a reverse appraisal of timber, and then going back to the purchase costs and getting the percentages and getting it that way. There's ways to go back and get it retroactively. If you inherited property, well, it's a bit better deal if you inherit your property, because it's the fair market value, or what they call stepped up basis, of the timber on the decedent's death or 6 months thereafter. So if you inherited property, you're in a little bit better of a basis situation, possibly. For gifted property, it's a bit more complicated. For timber property that has appreciated, and most of it has, the basis is the donor's adjusted basis, and that's also known as the carryover rule. So basically, that your basis is what the donor's basis was. However you calculate your basis, you want to keep records and verify how this was done, how it was calculated. All right, we're going to go through a quick example. This is a pretty simple example, just to kind of show how this works. And some of you I know have seen this before. So a storm damaged Mrs. Smith's timber tract. Before the storm, the fair market value of the timber was $10,000. After the storm, it was only $1,000. She lost $9,000 of timber value from that storm. However, can she deduct that $9,000? Well, the thing is, her basis is $5,000 in that timber. So the amount of casualty loss deduction is limited to $5,000. Remember the rule: deductible casual loss held for business or investment purposes is the smaller of adjusted basis for timber loss. So that's a very simple example, but that's the reality. And like I said, if your basis turns out to be zero and you wish to be reimbursed or get recover some of your lost value in timber, you're going to want to consider having some kind of timber insurance so that can happen. All right. I encourage you to check out the National Timber Tax website. There is an excellent presentation on that site by Dr. Linda Wong. She's no longer in that position, and it's from 2017, but most of those tax laws are still apply, I believe. And she goes through some basis calculations and in much greater detail than I'm going in here. So I encourage you to go to timbertax.org. There's a lot of resources there on timber taxes, basis, some webinars, really, really great stuff on timber tax. That's my go-to place for timber tax information. North Carolina Cooperative Extension has a good publication on understanding timber basis and how to come up with it. And then, of course, if you're working with a forester, I know a lot of landowners work with a consulting forester, and that's a great thing, especially if you've got a lot of timber value and your objectives are financial and economic. You want to maximize timber growth, timber value. I strongly recommend you work with a consulting forester, or your tax accountant is a good person to talk to get more information on how to come up with your basis. All right. I'm going to switch gears now, go into that next section on building resilience, and we're going to consider new forest. So we don't have a forest now. We're looking to plant trees. What are some things we can do to help us to have that stand be resilient? And it really comes down to good forest management. And aside from site, when you're deciding which trees to plant, which densities, what are your objectives? That's really the first thing to consider. That's the most important thing. Are you interested in maximizing timber value? Or are you interested in balancing timber value with other values like wildlife habitat? Another big consideration is, are you going to burn? Do you want to use fire in your management? That's going to be a huge thing as we think about new forests. So getting right down to the soil, that's kind of the first thing to look at when you're looking at your site. I really like this CRIF forest soil classification methodology of looking at soil, because it's simple. There's basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different kind of broad categories of soils with this tool, and it goes from wet to dry. CRIF H is your muck soils, or really deep organic soils. The Everglades, there's a soil category called Gator, that's H. And then all the way over to this, your high and dry, scrubby soils, and then everything in between. You got your flatwoods, your wet and mesic flatwoods in the middle here, where you've got your a sandy layer, and then a spodic horizon, and that's going to stop water. So these are your flatwood soils, and so on. So I encourage you look at this publication. It's called Using Soils to Guide Fertilizer Recommendations. I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to circle back around to this guide when we talk about fertility, but this is an excellent publication. Another good resource that's out there, of course, is the NRCS Web Soil Survey. You can find the soil types on your property, and then you can, when you find your soil types, you can relate those back to these CRIF groups. So, in other words, so there's the really wet soil I was talking about that you might find in here. You've got Gator, which is CRIF H. That's your histosols, your deep organics. So there's your that's some tools to use to assess your soils. And from there, we can look at some of the vegetation that's growing, and of course, all plants grow on a range of sites from wet to dry, right? So when we're looking at cypress, for instance, we know that grows on pretty poorly drained, very poorly drained soils. You find that down in the swamps. Something like cactus, reindeer moss, turkey oak, those are kind of more of the high and dry. And then we've got a whole bunch of stuff that's growing in the middle. So I've got some gallberry on my land. I've got some wax myrtle. I also have pitcher plants. So, you know, if you've got some of that overlap, you know, you can kind of tell which drainage class, which moisture class you're in, and kind of make some decisions based on that. So your soil drainage, your soil moisture should play into your decisions on what kinds of trees to plant. This is also in that using soils to guide fertilizer recommendations. This chart here, very, very useful. So getting back to the tree species, once you've got an idea of what sites you're working with, your soil drainage, types of soil, is it sandy? Is it a loam? Is it clay? You'll have, you know, kind of a suite of trees that you can plant on that site, because a lot of trees will grow on a range of sites. Or you may be at an extreme and you might be more narrowed down to one or two tree species that you can work with on a particular site. But on a lot of sites, you know, a lot of sites will grow more than one kind of tree, and really comes down to what is the best fit with your management goals, and are you going to use fire? Those are really important questions. This is a very general, broad statement that's a little bit dangerous, but trees native to our region tend to be more resilient to high winds and flooding associated with hurricanes. There are some that are more resistant than others, for sure, and we'll be getting into that a little bit. But native plants, native trees are generally the best fit with most of our forest management objectives. All right, this table comes straight out of that guide. It gives some nice descriptions, very, very simple general descriptions about where these trees grow, what kinds of sites they do best on. For loblolly pine, they'll do really well on fertile sites, old ag sites, clays. That's where your loblolly pine is really going to respond and do really well. Doesn't do well on eroded, low fertility sites, deep sands. It's really not going to do very well on those types of sands. But if you've got old ag fields, clays, loblolly pine is going to do great on those. And longleaf pine will do really great on a broad spectrum of sites as well. It's going to be more competitive in growth and performance on kind of higher and drier sites, where loblolly and slash isn't going to do as well. Longleaf will do pretty well on some of those sandy loams. Sand pine, of course, just like the name implies, it grows on sandy soils that are rarely saturated with water. Deep sands, high and dry, that's a sand pine site. You might be limited to that if you've got some scrub, areas, really high, really deep sands. Generally poor to wind resistance, not generally a good choice on those coastal counties where you're going to have high hurricane winds. But if you're interested in some of those lower value or short-term rotation products, sand pine can be a viable option for some things like that. Shortleaf is common in Florida, generally in that Red Hills area of the state, up around Tallahassee, Jefferson County. Some of those areas you don't find it much in the rest of the state. But like longleaf, it relies on prescribed fire for management. Low susceptibility to wind damage, so it's a good one. It can withstand good winds, but of course, as with a lot of trees, uprooting can occur when root systems are shallow. One thing about longleaf pine, I'm going to go back to that longleaf pine site. Longleaf pine does really well with high winds to a point, because it grows a very, very deep taproot. That's one advantage of longleaf pine relative to a lot of these other pines, is it grows a really deep taproot. So it does really well with high winds. Now, if those winds get high enough, it's going to snap. Any tree is going to snap with Category 4 winds. But longleaf does pretty well with high winds because of that deep taproot. Also, I don't think I mentioned this clearly, but longleaf pine, if you're interested in longleaf pine, you're going to want to be using fire in your management, right? All right, getting on to slash pine, grows on moist, sandy flatwoods. Your savanna sites, you know, where you've got some moisture, they tends to do pretty well. Doesn't do really well on higher, drier sites like your longleaf will. More resistant than loblolly from high winds, but less so than longleaf or shortleaf. And then down in the central and South Florida, we get into the South Florida slash pine, which is similar to our northern variety, but it's got some smaller cones. Also, it starts in the grass phase, like the longleaf does, and it's well adapted to wind. Of course, being in South Florida in the Keys, you would think that would be a very hardy species in terms of wind resistance, and it is. All right, so after some of these past hurricanes, Hurricane Opal, they did some research, and I think this research was done, you can kind of tell by the species that are listed here, that some of the most wind resistant species were those listed here: dogwood, live oak, sabal palm, sand live oak, southern magnolia. So I mean, the good news about these is these are really good to have around your home. You know, these are species that are going to withstand high winds and not break. Some of the dangerous trees that they found, sweet gum, loblolly pine, those were the trees that they found did not fare well. Sand pine. So if around your homesteads, where you're not growing pines, some of these other species like dogwoods, palms, oaks, southern magnolia, they do really well in the wind. So consider those. What about pines? Well, after Hurricane Katrina, which did quite a bit of damage in southern pines in parts of the Southeast, they did some studies and found that loblolly pine kind of had the highest percentage of mortality, 26%. Slash pine, as always, intermediate, and then longleaf pine sustained the least damage after that storm. And then we find these with other storms too. Longleaf tends to be the most resilient in terms of sustaining that wind. Now, as I've said kind of throughout this whole thing, you know, when it's a Category 4 or 5 winds coming through, you know, not much is going to be standing after that. And the only thing standing after a storm like that are trees that can bend over and then kind of bounce back. You know, some of the younger trees that are around, you'll see those still standing, but trees that will, you know, can't bend all the way to the ground are just going to snap. And that's what we saw in Hurricane Michael when that Category 4 monster went through the panhandle. And this is a photo taken by our former state forester, Jim Carls. All right, planting density. This topic can be a can of worms because it's darned if you do and darned if you don't either way, right? So planting density is a difficult topic. You know, it really depends on our objectives. You know, what are your objectives? If you've got timber objectives, you know, you want a little bit higher density. You want better formed trees. If you're wildlife habitat, if you're managing for quail, you know, you're not gonna want to plant as high density as if you're managing for timber. So, you know, generally higher stand densities allow trees to lean on each other, and they create buffer, you know, with each other. So, you know, we want some density in there for that, to protect the trees from high winds. Of course, when we get into high density, especially as that stand matures, we can have increased wildfire risks, southern pine beetle, especially in the loblolly pine. So, we're going to want to try to manage that density to some extent if we're carrying on that stand to higher age and higher value forest products. And if we're thinning, we want to do that thing outside of hurricane season. As growth rates will decrease as stand density increases, as those trees get bigger, they get closer to each other, and they're not going to be able to really harness those site resources as well as if you take some of those trees out and allocate more of that more of those site resources to the trees so they can respond and keep on growing. So, as with all things, hurricane resiliency has to be made with these other factors, density versus growth, density versus insects, density versus habitat values if you're trying to balance timber and habitat. Generally speaking, the 600 to 750 trees per acre range, I think is reasonable for most objectives, and then thin as needed for other objectives. Of course, you ask 3 foresters what density is best, you're going to get 3 different answers. So, guided by your management objectives. All right, ready to plant now. Got our density figured out, got our tree species. We're going to order seedlings. Always best to get that order in early because supplies don't always last. So if you're planting this coming December 2021, January, February 2022, you're going to get your seedling order in this summer. That's the best time to get your seedling order in 6 months before. And you want to try to get your seedlings from a nursery in your region, generally within your latitude or local seed source. So if you're in North Florida, then seedlings sourced from that area, southern Georgia, southern Alabama, southern Mississippi would be reasonable choices. The more local, the better. Site preparation. Each of these topics is a webinar all its own, right? Preparing the site for planting. And with respect to hurricane resilience, preparing the site and getting those trees established is going to allow the best root growth to give those trees the best anchor they have in a storm. So that's where this all comes down. We want to, do our due diligence to get those trees going. If you've got a site that looks like this, full of hardwoods and full of all kinds of woody shrubs and other things that are going to shade out pines. Pines are shade intolerant, don't do really well with a lot of vegetation. So if you've got a site like this and you want to put pines in, there's going to be some work to do, mechanical, some fire, maybe some herbicides. Using fire is a relatively low cost, effective way to get a site ready for planting. It's not always going to do the trick the first time, depending on what you're starting with. So definitely prepare the site. If you're planting on pastures, it's going to be a good idea to scalp and maybe rip, depending on what kind of soil you're in. If you've got a hard pan or that spodic horizon way down, some ripping might help to get those roots down. You want to get that sod cleared off in the planting area, and then plant your trees in that cleared off scalp. Trees aren't going to grow really well in these heavy sods. And then bedding. Bedding is basically mechanically creating a bed in which to plant trees. This is used on some of your wetter sites like flatwood sites, some of your wet savanna sites. you create that bed so you can get those trees, those seedlings out of the water. So if you have a heavy rain event, those seedlings are protected from the water. You're going to want to consider bedding very carefully based on your objectives and the site. Consider that very carefully. If you're interested in maintaining some of that diverse ground cover that's in there, if you're interested in habitat values, bedding can do some significant damage to that seed bed, that seed source. So consider that very carefully. Bedding isn't for every site. If you've got high and dry, if you're on sandy loams, you don't need to bed. Bedding is just going to be destructive on those cases. But if you're in wet savannas, wet flatwoods, it can help. All right, when planting is underway, it's going to be best for you or your representative, your forester, if you're working with a forester, for them to be on site and make sure that they're doing a good job, that they're planting it at the correct depth, that they're not J-rooting. If you're planting longleaf pine, the depth is really important. You're not going to want to cover up that bud. They can't be too deep. They can't be too shallow. So attention to detail, especially with longleaf, is important. You're going to want to make sure that the planting crew is doing necessary culling too. In every bag of seedlings, not every single seedling is going to go on the ground. Generally, there's going to be some culls. So you want to make sure that they're going through that bag of seedlings, getting the junk out, making sure that that you're planting the best stock. And then, contact your contractor immediately if you have concerns, or have your consultant do that. Make sure everything is addressed up front. There's some great resources on planting pines. These two resources were adapted from an old Forest Service publication that was out on this. I want to do one for Florida, but right now North Carolina, Mississippi State both have these. These are excellent publications. Go through a lot of these details we're talking about: site preparation, planting. Like I said, these topics are kind of webinars unto themselves. So if you have further questions, information needs about planting southern pines, these are some good resources. Fertility. Another topic all its own, but we're talking about resilience. It's something that we can consider. Soils that support southern pine stands in the South generally are lacking in some of those macro and micronutrients. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And we can supplement those soils to promote early site occupancy, and we want a good functioning canopy leaf area. So again, this goes back to your objectives, and your site. What are your soils? What are your objectives? If you really want to maximize timber, if timber income and timber growth is really important to you, it can pay off to invest in fertilization. And again, I would guide you to our publication. We're circling back around to this publication, using soils to guide fertilizer recommendation for southern pines. That's a great publication, really good way to learn about soil classifications, and it has fertility recommendations for all of those soil types. So that's a great resource. Also, I need to give a plug to Prescribed Fire in terms of reducing competition and releasing nutrients back to the soil. And of course, for reducing our wildfire risk by reducing that fuel accumulation. I can't say enough for the benefits of Prescribed Fire for forestry, for wildlife, and especially if you're balancing that production forestry and habitat objectives. All right, I'm going to switch gears, talk about infrastructure. First, I'm going to take a sip of water. Slow moving storm, it's going to drop a lot of water. And we're going to want to make sure that our roads are holding up to that. We want to consider upgrading our roads. If we want to have it's best if there's a crown, and if it's gravel, to help out with that that drainage. I mean, a thing to consider, a good question to ask yourself, how do my roads hold up to a summer, a regular summer thunderstorm? If there's problems after a regular summer thunderstorm, heavy rain in a short amount of time, it's probably going to be helpful to do some work on those roads. Do some improvements if you can. Check your culverts, check your bridges, make sure they're all sound, make sure that they're providing adequate drainage and water is flowing freely. Some of these things are things that we're doing right before a hurricane, but they're a constant, they're a part of this constant process of maintaining our resilience, is checking these culverts, checking our drainage to make sure that water is flowing adequately. And then we get this concept of daylighting, which is removing vegetation, trees within 6 to 10 feet of that road, so that after a rain, the road will dry more quickly, and it also reduces the amount of material that'll fall across the roads, and decrease your time you're spending clearing stuff off the roads. You're going to be doing that anyway, but if you can cut back on that, all the better. First and foremost, with roads infrastructure, make sure that you're meeting the state's best management practices for silviculture. The best management practices are really, really good, sound guidelines. They're research, they're science-based. Make sure that your roads are properly designed, your culverts are properly sized to prevent blowouts. So really encourage everyone, if you don't already have one, get that Florida silviculture best management practice guide that helps you out with roads. It helps you out with fertilization, with site preparation, tree planting, you name it. All of those, everything that you're doing on your land to manage forests, there's best management practices for those to make sure that water quality is protected. This Forest Service road construction maintenance book is excellent. I strongly encourage you to look at that, especially if you're designing roads on a new forest, or you're putting new roads in, new access. And then Alabama Cooperative Extension has a good book on road construction. Like I said, all of these links are live on the PDF copy of this that's available to you. All right, switching gears into getting organized, records, documentation, insurance. This is one of those do as I say, not as I do. I've got one of these file cabinets at home and I can't remember where stuff is in it, but really important to know where this material is, where these forms are, or your documentation. Keep in mind that assistance for disaster recovery, we're learning this from after Hurricane Michael. Some of the financial assistance that's available, it's not available until months or years after a hurricane. Hurricane Michael happened in 2018. It's 2021. People are still filing for their assistance, still getting forms filled out for assistance. Really important to be organized, have all this documentation together, all your photos, your records, keep it all together, keep it handy. And of course, for a purpose of insurance, you want to have thorough record keeping of the damages and the losses sustained on your forest land, as well as your cleanup and recovery efforts. Review your insurance, but if you do have insurance, make sure that you have adequate coverage for flood insurance, for property, vehicles, forest stands, equipment, and also be aware that there might be some limitations on the timing, right? How soon coverage will take effect. Generally, insurance won't cover damage if the policy was not in place before a hurricane was on its way, right? So if it's not the time to get the insurance when you see the storm coming. You're going to want to have that in place well before. And then the two general types of timber insurance are standing timber for your mature stands, and then your reforestation for your younger stands that aren't merchantable right now, but you want to have some resources to help regenerate those stands if they're damaged. Getting back to inventory, you want to make sure your inventory is kept in a safe place. And of course, it's going to be used to come up with your fair market value of your forest stand, assessing that loss. That your inventory is going to help with that. And then, of course, we talked about the casualty loss. Keep your inventory stored in multiple places. It's on the cloud. On the internet is a good place if you've got an account, a Google account, Google file. That's a good place to keep it versus on your computer. Waterproof file box is nice. My wife and I have a waterproof file box where it's small, but we keep all of our important stuff in that box, so it's ready to go if we have to get out quick. So it's a good thing to have that waterproof file box that you can just grab and take with you. And another thing you're going to want to do, of course, is take pictures, right? Take pictures before the storm and after the storm. You want to have documentation. It's really important that you have everything documented. So take pictures of all your forest stands. What do they look like before the storm hits, and what do they look like after? And that's all going to be really important for insurance, for assistance moving forward. All right, emergency planning. So we all get on the NOAA Hurricane Center site. I guess most of us do when there's a hurricane coming. Look at that cone. Where's that storm going? This is what it looks like now. There's a little depression somewhere out here, but in a month or two, it's going to get more active, right? We're going to see these tropical storms and hurricanes coming our way. And the NOAA site is a really good place to go. That's where I go first. And then after that, I look on Wonder Map or Weather Channel or one of those, look at the radar and check it out on the radar. Look at multiple things. You can get different information from multiple sources. And then you can get connected to emergency alerts. So for instance, I'm connected to emergency alerts. I get a email, I get a text, I get a phone call. I probably get too much, but these emergency alerts can be very helpful because you might not be near your phone, you might not be near your computer, you're going to be near something that might alert you to a storm or event. We just had a tornado watch the other day. Your area is in a tornado watch, so it was good to know that, and I would not have known that otherwise. So really good to stay connected to emergency alerts. And speaking of tornadoes, if you're experiencing a hurricane, if you're in a hurricane, if you can get those emergency alerts about tornadoes that are spinning off, because tornadoes are common in hurricanes and probably responsible for quite a bit of the damage that happens from hurricanes. That's another good way to get quick information on tornadoes that might be in your area. All right, kind of winding down toward the end of this. This will be a recurring theme throughout all of our presentations. This whole webinar series is connecting with professionals. A lot of you do that or doing that anyway. You're connected to these webinars. You get our land steward updates. You're working with your forester, your county forester with the Florida Forest Service. Your BMP forest can help you with those roads, those drainage. He or she can pay you a visit and go over your forest roads and maybe point out where things can be improved, or maybe you're good to go. All these people can help you, because one thing that all of these folks have in common is they're paying attention. They're connected to the resources that are available to help before, during, and after a storm, especially after the storm. The cost share programs. So your county extension agent, generally your ag natural resources agent, is going to be there to help you with forestry and agricultural issues. Florida Wildlife Commission biologists, landowner assistance program biologists, they are plugged in and ready to help. USDA. Now this is really important. If you get one thing out of this webinar, I want it to be this. You can get your forms with the USDA Farm Service Agency filled out ahead of time, right? So each year, when there's disasters, emergencies, the USDA provides programs such as the Emergency Forest Restoration Program. That website's here. The NRCS also has some disaster assistance opportunities as well. One thing that you have to do when you're applying for any of these USDA programs is complete farm records. And you can fill those out ahead of time. I called the Farm Service Agency and she said, yes, encourage people to fill out these forms ahead of time. Because if you wait till after the storm to fill out these forms, there will be a backlog, okay? So with the for instance, with the Emergency Forest Restoration Program, there's still a backlog after Hurricane Michael. 3 years after that storm, they're still trying to get through all of those applications because landowners waited until after the storm, after they got hit, after they lost timber, to fill out and apply for assistance. You can fill out those forms ahead of time so they're ready to go. Also, when you fill out those forms ahead of time, you'll receive e-notifications about recovery programs from the Farm Service Agency. So you're already connected. So, like I said, if you get one thing out of this webinar, you do one thing, fill out those Farm Service Agency records, farm records, get in their system, and that way you're set to go. If you already have those records in, and some of you I think probably do, make sure they're up to date, make sure they're complete, right? Make sure if you've added on to your property or if you've done some things, you might have to go in there and do some updates. But yeah, make sure your records are up to date. And this is a good place to go to get connect to assistance and find your FSA. Farmers.gov Connect is a really good site if you want to connect to your Farm Service Agency. Many of you are probably working with a consulting forester. Strongly recommend that, especially if timber is a primary objective. You have a lot of value in your timber. Consulting foresters are great. They'll provide assistance in all phases of management, the planning, inventory, the planting, all the operations. They can really help you out, be a great resource, and to give you a leg up after a disaster because they've got all those connections. We've got a publication on selecting a consulting forester. In Georgia and Alabama, they have a registered forester program. They have licensed licensed foresters. Florida does not have a registered licensed forester program, and so there's some credentials that you should look for when you're hiring a forester, because in Florida, essentially anybody can call themselves a forester. So you want to make sure that they have certain credentials before you hire them. Make sure that they're involved somewhat with some of the organizations that foresters are involved with, such as the Society of American Foresters, Association of Consulting Foresters. The SAF, or the Society of American Foresters, has a certified forester program, and many foresters are certified foresters. They have that CF after that name. So select forester carefully. Connect with the industry. I encourage you to join the Florida Forestry Association. Get involved. That's how you get to know your local loggers, local consultants. Everybody involved with growing trees in Florida is connected to the Florida Forestry Association. They have an annual meeting every year, and then they have two or more membership meetings, and they have them in different parts of the state. So you can go to your membership meeting, get to know all the guys, all the gals in your region that are working in forestry. That's people that are in the private sector, loggers, agency professionals, Forest Service. You get to know everybody through the Florida Forestry Association. So I want to give them a plug. Also, I want to give certification a plug. The American Tree Farm System and the Florida Tree Farm Program These are important entities to get connected with. If you have 10 acres of forest land or more, you're eligible to get certified in the tree farm program. Well, why should they get certified? Well, when you're certified, your wood is a part of a certified chain of custody, known as two labels that go along with wood that comes off of tree farms, and that's SFI, or Sustainable Forestry Initiative, also PEFC. You might have seen these labels on some products that you buy, you know, on the back of a magazine, or on the back of a box of tissues. You might see PEFC, and you might see SFI logo too. Mills are looking for certified material because it is in demand nationally and internationally, excuse me. So having your forest certified may not give you a price premium for your products, but it gives you some market access because mills are looking for certified wood. So if you have 10 acres or more, you can get certified in the tree farm program. Your consulting forester, also Florida Forest Service county foresters can help you get connected to those. And of course, you can drop me a line. I'm happy to provide contacts as well. All right, that concludes my presentation. I want to encourage you to use that Q&A box to put in some questions if you have any, or maybe share an anecdote or two, or give any kind of feedback. I appreciate you hanging with me this afternoon and for the presentation. We did record this as well, so this will be available on demand. I'm going to put it on our email update that's going out tomorrow. Want to encourage you to use that Q&A to provide any questions. While you're doing that, I'll go through the rest of my closing remarks. When you leave this webinar, the evaluation should pop up automatically. And if it doesn't, you're going to get a follow-up email tomorrow, and that will also have the webinar link. So please fill that webinar evaluation out this afternoon or tomorrow, whenever you get the link for it. Looks like we got some questions, comments. All right. Do most of the best practices that you covered here pertain to hardwood stands? If those hardwood stands are being actively managed for if they have silvicultural operations going on in them, then yes, absolutely. The best management practices will apply, pertain to hardwood stands. All right, John, you're welcome. Happy to plug the Forestry Association and the tree farm. I had you in mind when I put those slides together. All right, how long can timber lay on the ground before it's no longer of value? That's a great question. And it's going to vary on the size of the material. Generally, when we get to 3 months, 2 to 3 months, the quality of that material is going to go down, obviously. So the quicker we can get it off the ground, the better. Beyond that 3-4 months of it being on the ground, you know, the decomposition is going to set in pretty quickly. Now the material could still be usable for some of that lower value products, such as pulp and chips, but for structural saw timber, structural hard products, you're gonna have to get that wood off the ground within the first 3 months or so after that storm. Beyond then, it's not going to be good for that. So, yeah, depends on the type of material and the products in question. Good question. And I'll be talking about that more in the third webinar on the recovery. We'll be going through some of those details on you know, what types of trees are standing, what kind of damage are we looking at, and what are some of the practices we can do to help us in that salvaging decision and getting things off the ground. All right. Also want to point out that the slides, I went through this at the beginning, but utilize our website to access the slides for this presentation and the other materials that we have linked. Again, how do you get to that? Well, here's the website. When you click on that link, you're gonna get to this site right here, and then at the third paragraph or this third section, finding recordings, links, materials, all that's right at that link. And then when you get to that link, there'll be drop down menus for all the different webinar series that we've got. I really want to give a shout out to our partners, all of our supporters that provide financial support for the Florida Land Steward program, and also work closely with us on our outreach to forest landowners and other types of landowners around the state, and forest professionals, natural resource professionals. Really want to give a good shout out to Farm Credit Associations of Florida that wanted to step up and provide some support for this program. This is a big topic for them as well. So appreciate everybody's support. Let's see, any other questions, comments? Happy to hang on and answer any other questions that come out. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and wish you all the best in this this coming hurricane season. Best result will be that we dodged the bullet, but according to the forecast, we've got some storms coming our way. So due diligence, and may the force be with you in this coming season. And thank you very much for joining us. That concludes this webinar.